Hello, I would like to welcome you in a new session of podcast Social Science and Society. I am with you, Sari Hanafi, Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies at American University of Beirut. I would like to welcome today Dina Kiwan from the University of Birmingham. Dina Kiwan is a British Egyptian professor in comparative education at this university, having joined it in 2017. She is the College of Social Science Deputy Director for Research and Knowledge Transfer. I have the pleasure to know her before as a colleague and friend in the Department of Sociology at my university, at American University of Beirut. She spent 4 years there. Her interests center around sociological and political philosophical examinations of inclusive citizenship through the lens of educational policy, naturalization policy, and migration policy, in particular in the context of pluralistic multicultural societies, and also societies in conflict. These interests in critical policy analysis are complemented by an interest on how those deemed to be marginalized and vulnerable, disability, gender, sexuality, asylum, refugee status, race, religion, and ethnicity. So how these marginalized and vulnerable identity constitute themselves as a political actors. In addition, her work addresses broader themes of the political sociology of global knowledge production. I was honored to endorse her last book, Academic Freedom and the Transnational Production of Knowledge, last year. She has extensive and long-standing academic and policy experience and networks in the UK and internationally. In the field of citizenship, she is also a member of the UK government's Migration Advisory Committee, appointed by the Home Secretary from 2021 to 2027, and co-academic director of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office flagship around the 25 million pound research commissioning center. This is from 2023 to 2028. Dina Kiwan, so I would like we start by telling us about your why did you choose social science? I know you started by psychology. I mean, what kind of context you grow up? I know you was born cosmopolitan. I mean, with a different parent. Can you tell us a little bit to contextualize your thought later on and your knowledge production?
Sure, yes, of course. Thank you for inviting me to be on this podcast. It's a pleasure. So just a bit of context. I'm half English, half Egyptian, born in England, but grew up in Kuwait. So my education was very much within an Arab context, and if you did well at school, you know, you're encouraged to go towards the sciences. And I was in an English system school, and so when I did A-levels, as a good student, I ended up choosing biology, chemistry, and maths. I also was doing French initially, but then because of workload and also it was a very traditional course focusing on literature, I dropped that. But when it came to what I would study at university, I remember feeling that I couldn't do medicine. It's I'm just not the right person for it psychologically. So I ended up doing kind of something as close as possible, which was psychology and physiology.
Yeah, actually, psychology in many places worldwide, sometimes it's in a science,
It's more
a
of a
department
science.
of science.
Yes, and as I was at University of Oxford,
Especially in Anglo-Saxon.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
And behavioralism.
Yeah. So I was at University of Oxford, a very scientific kind of framing of psychology. We didn't even do any of the history of psychology. It was very decontextualized and focused on the empirical, and I did all my physiology courses with the medical students. But as I was doing this work, I was particularly interested in the cultural aspects, and I did as my dissertation. I was interested in the cultural differentiations in presentations of eating disorders. And it was interesting to me that eating disorders seem to be predominantly a more Western phenomenon, and why was that? But yet the paradigms in psychology were extremely limited. You couldn't really dig into, you could show that there were differences, but you couldn't dig in any substantive manner to understand the context. I mean, this was back in the 90s, and I think psychology has obviously developed around areas of cultural psychology then. But when I was doing my postgraduate work, and then I went to Harvard, and I was doing an MA in psychopathology. Actually, I was in the PhD program initially, and I decided to leave after being introduced, because in the American system you do so many more minors and different options, and so I started doing sociology and anthropology and history of science, and I was so excited by these courses, and I felt, what am I doing in psychology when I have these sociological and cultural interests? So I graduated with a master's from Harvard and left, and then I worked for a number of years, partly just depending on, I got an internship at Amnesty International at the United Nations, and so I became introduced to the world of some international law and human rights, and it happened by chance that I moved into the field of education, and there seemed to be an opportunity for me to bring together interests in social justice, which I realised was very much what I was interested in, and issues of identity and belonging. And it was when I was working part-time that eventually I then started to do my PhD part-time back at UCL in London. And it was in sociology of education. I looked at, there was the introduction of a new program of study in schools called citizenship education, which was quite controversial at the time. It was thought that this would be like propaganda for students, but instead...
A sort of civil education.
A civil education. And it had always been quite low status and not statutory. So it moved to becoming statutory in schools. But my dissertation was around the fact that it was a very narrow conception of what citizenship was. It was exclusive and neglected ethnic and religious diversity in its conception.
Yeah, I notice we move quickly to your knowledge of production, so I noticed that you have a non-legalistic approach of citizenship, and you are interested that when we go beyond, if you like, that by constitution we are equal, I mean, to address all the question of diversity, and
Yes, I mean, what I was looking at starting from my PhD and then after that was different framings of citizenship, whether that's a moral framing, whether it's a participatory framing, or whether it's framed primarily in relation to identity and belonging, not solely looking at it. And I'm not trained as a lawyer, so it wasn't a legalistic conception. And I was also very interested in the relationship between the conception of the human and the conception of the citizen. And how, and other scholars have talked about, to become a citizen, you first need to be recognized as a human being.
Yeah.
And we see that very widely in how, even though people may have citizenship on paper, you have rungs of citizenship. So whether you're from a marginalized group, whether you are, less have lower ranking of social economic status.
So you went. So if you like, you went farther than Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt complained that there is no human rights, there is citizen rights. Once you are outside of this nation state, you don't have a right. And
Yes.
she was stateless, and she experienced this. But you go farther. You say, even if you are citizens,
Yes.
citizen on paper is different.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I wouldn't like to claim to have gone further than Hannah Arendt, but it's a different. It's a similar application, but looking even within the nation state itself. Absolutely. Yeah.
Looking to your CV, Dina, I noticed that you wrote about multiculturalism, multicultural citizenship, in the time where it was some controversies over multiculturalism.
Yeah.
And some argue that the controversies come from the application, and the others say no, but from the very principle on that. So how you situate your work within this debate?
Yeah, I would say I was quite influenced by Will Kimlicka, political philosopher in Canada. Obviously, his work, has been seminal in the field of multicultural citizenship. But obviously, his theorizations emerge very much from the Canadian context. When I was first doing my research in this domain, within the UK context, multiculturalism was reasonably well thought of, but with changes in government and increasingly very much there were political slogans of multiculturalism is dead. But yet, I think even when one compares what multiculturalism is in the UK context compared to France, you can see quite stark differences, and France, with its very secular, laïcité, it's not quite secularism, has been, I think, much more challenging, although, quite significant developments in France on that. I think there's always been a bit of a challenge, I think, trying to then transplant the idea of multicultural citizenship to outside of the Western contexts. And, I had been involved in some initiatives where it was looking at diversity in, the Middle East, for example, and can that be understood in those theoretical frameworks, which I think pose some challenges and are not really applicable.
By the way, I invited Will Kimlicka to American University of Beirut. Actually, you didn't mention, and we got to know each other as a colleague and friends at American University of Beirut. You stay around 6 years or a little bit more, and we regret. I mean, I talk on behalf of my department that we lost you. But so glad when I see how your scholarship are vibrant. I mean that it's okay. So when I invite Will Kimlicka to Lebanon, it's exactly to reflect on how we can, if you like, project critically, culturally, multiculturalism, his conception, his Canadian, or if you like, I would say Western, because it's Australia adopted his models, United States even. I mean, he was influential on all these countries, to Lebanon. And Lebanon, I mean, a I don't know if I can use the word ethnic, but at least multi-sectarian, confessional society. And what was very interesting, Dina, in the discussion, how some scholar from the audience resisting this. I mean, say no, it's a Western. We are all Arab culture. I mean, there is also kind of hegemonic conception
Yeah.
that we are not diverse. We are
Yes.
one. So we'll communicate. I mean, really interact, and it was a very interesting discussion in that sessions.
Yeah, I actually was involved with when I was at AUB, I was contacted by an organisation in Canada, and it was an initiative that was looking at multiculturalism and other things in global perspective. And I was asked actually to write a paper on it on Lebanon, and I did so, and I'd be happy to revisit that and share it with you. So that was probably almost 10 years ago now.
Okay, very interesting. Look, let us jump to your last book that really I have the honor to read it even before the publication and endorse it, because I found it extremely innovative in its methodology. It's about the question of academic freedom, diversity within academia, and in relation to transnational knowledge production. Can you tell us a little bit about the book, and then I have 2-3 questions about this.
Sure. So my approach to the book was to think about academic freedom outside the usual predominantly nationalist kind of frame. If you look at most work on academic freedom, it tends to be more legal or historical, and usually focusing on a single country context, and usually in the literature that tends to be the US or the UK, sometimes Europe. And then alternatively you have large big data sets of indicators of academic freedom that don't really give you much understanding at all of the context, and have an approach of kind of ranking countries on abstract criteria as to what academic freedom is. So because I myself had the lived experience of being in the UK, I've also, as a postgraduate student, I also taught undergraduate students in the US, plus I've been in Lebanon, and also having grown up in the Gulf and knowing about contexts there, and our university also has a branch campus. I wanted to take a different approach and really understand from the perspectives of academics doing these so-called controversial research, what the lived experiences were like in the different contexts. And this would be controversial according to the specific contexts, but also trying to understand that academic freedom, especially in the context of the internationalization and massification of higher education, we can't think of it in terms of solely what does academic freedom look like in a single country, without looking at how we're now in the context of global knowledge production and research partnerships, and often struggling to have equitable partnerships in research projects between the global north and global south, and all the institutional mechanisms that perhaps inadvertently put up barriers for academic freedom and equity in knowledge production. So that's what motivated me to take that approach, and also particularly to bring academic freedom together with knowledge production, where the emphasis often is on, freedom of speech and students on campus. I wanted to shift it more to the experience of the academic in producing knowledge.
So you reflect in specific case studies and beyond but if I remember, Lebanon, United Arab Emirates, United States, and UK. Can you, for instance, give us one or two examples where academic freedom is not related to the national context, and how it's is hurted when we start to think about publications, for instance. So, can you give us two examples, for instance, about from
Yeah.
your book?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that comes more to. So if I think of, large international projects that are funded, so for example, like in the UK, we have very prestigious research council funding, but there are usually quite specific rules about who can hold the funds, who can be the PI, that's the principal investigator, and how the funds are distributed to the global South partners, for example. And there you can see very clearly that these mechanisms inadvertently undermine equitable knowledge production. Also, issues around data sharing, for example, ideas around who has kind of ownership overall of the whole research project and its strategy, has shown that it's not related to the specifics of a national context, but it's the problems when your PI always has to be a global North researcher, for example, or only a set amount of funds go to the global South.
And I do remember there is some constraint if you research sensitive issues such as on Palestine, whether history or politics or sociology. Is it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. I think you always have. I mean, besides having topics where sometimes certain things are in vogue or things tend to not be funded by research councils, you have to think very carefully about how you frame your work. So, for example, if we take race, for example, colleagues I have who work in race often complain that the big research councils don't fund race. But yet if you find ways to kind of frame it and link it to other priorities, you can get that done. And similarly in my work, I have a large research project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It's it's called a Global Challenges Research Fund that specifically focuses on the global South, funding in the global South. And so this was under a call called Education and Conflict. So my work is framed under that, and I, obviously from my partnerships in the Middle East, it gave a great opportunity to do work on the region, including Palestine, looking at issues that are central to my interests of inclusion and citizenship under the themes of education and conflict. And disability itself is particularly interesting in the Palestinian context. We're not just talking about an apolitical construction of disability. We're talking about it in the context of occupation and conflict, and that has quite a different connotation in that sense. So I think framing is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. I was when I read your book, I was very interested in how you problematize academic freedom in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion, the famous DEI, and so your thesis basically that we need really to take seriously DEI before almost talking about academic freedom. So can you tell us a little bit about
Sure.
this point?
So I think the whole EDI kind of discourse is very much something that's of the global north. and it's in a context, obviously, where you have groups that have historically been excluded or marginalized in the context of the dominant white heterosexual global, Western majority. So we're talking about people from different ethnic and religious minorities, gender even, although gender now is less problematic in terms of opportunities than what we call BAME, that's Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, as well as other groups, whether it's disability or bisexuality and so on and so forth. And what we see in the public domain and the political domain, especially now under a conservative government, is that these minoritized groups are challenging the status quo of what is, the respected knowledge. And so there's a lot of critique at the level of disciplines, so there's critique of new disciplinary fields of study, like interdisciplinary. So whether it's gender studies or race or refugee studies, that these are seen as having less caliber than the true disciplines of history and philosophy and so on. Also you see it in terms of, even though academic freedom, the construct was set up to empower groups that don't have power to still have a voice, it's being weaponized instead to say, for those in power, we don't want to hear these voices. These are challenging the status quo. And so that was the kind of premise where I started from. And I was also interested in Judith Butler and her work. She's written on higher education and academic freedom, and she talks about Palestine and makes the point that if you're under occupation where you can't even travel, there are roadblocks stopping you getting to your university. You can't receive visitors, you can't go to conferences and so on. That in itself has undermined your academic freedom. There's basic requisites that are needed so that you have freedom to produce knowledge.
Again, I will open two brackets. I was honored to know Judith Butler on Palestine. She was in a tour organized by organization, both American and Palestinians, and I was a Palestinian counterpart, so I took them to show them the beginning of the wall. It was around 2001, this story. And I do remember how Judith Butler was really affected by the observation she did in that time. She realized by then, and I think this trip was a paradigm shift in her writing. I mean, focusing about the injustice. I mean, what the meaning of a settler colonial project, at least I would say in West Bank and Gaza, but at least how she said, and the beginning of the apartheid system, where you have a different roads of different society. People don't Palestinian can't go where the Jews, settler Jews are there, and so on. So Judith Butler, I noticed it was important for you, and Ben Borat, I think he did also, is a scholar of in education, has impact in your writing.
Yes.
I forgot his first name.
Yes, I guess that was in when I was working more in the field of multiculturalism.
Okay.
Ben Parath had done work on, her book is called Citizenship Under Fire, which she
Okay.
published. It was her
Yeah.
PhD work in 2006.
Yeah. Okay, so again, looking closely to your CV, I notice the nexus between your academic work and policy level. I will ask you later on about more about relationship to civil society and to lay person. But I mean, for now, just relationship to policy. So, and I noticed really you work preparing report, monitoring policy in UK here, but beyond. Can you tell us a little bit about your work of this nexus, if you like,
Sure.
research versus policy?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of work around citizenship in the policy domain in the UK, both in education, but also in the migration space and also naturalisation. So what you need to kind of show to become a British citizen. And so my early work, when I was doing my PhD, I actually had the good fortune to interview some very high-level policymakers, including at the time the lead minister of education, who was called David Blunkett, and himself visually impaired actually. And he also then moved to be the Home Secretary, so that's the head of all internal affairs and to do with migration. And his advisor, who himself was an academic, Sir Bernard Crick, who's now passed away, and he was a great mentor and a great character, and was David Blunkett's political advisor. And because I'd interviewed them and we got on quite well, they invited me to be involved as an advisory board member for deciding what the requirements should be for people with British citizenship. So in terms of, language requirements and also civic requirements. And so since that time, I've been involved in a number of initiatives and also written a report for education on how we can amend the citizenship curriculum to take account of ethnic and religious diversity. And that report was accepted and was thrilled to at the time. And it changed the policy in England for schools so that children had to engage with issues of ethnic and religious diversity, as well as Britain's place in Europe, and also understanding the context of the colonial legacy and the Commonwealth and everything else. So that was a big shift in education. And then since then, I've also been called on for initiatives with UNESCO, particularly around global citizenship, which became a big thing from about 2012. And I've written some seminal reports on that have because UNESCO works as a voluntary, it's not statutory, but yet what would be really great, and I've tried to pressure UNESCO on this, is actually to do an evaluation of what the impact has been on this kind of paradigm being available to governments. So it's hard to quantify what the impact is, but it's been very well received globally. And even in the Middle East, there's been some tensions around global citizenship.
Yeah, of course.
But there has been engagement with thinking what this means, and there's also people, there are kind of your more corporate conceptions of global citizenship, and then your more critical ones that actually challenge the hegemony of the global north and what global citizenship actually means. So it's quite a big space and it's ongoing. And then now, because of that work, I've actually, the last 3 years, been on a high-level committee that advises the government on migration. It's called the Migration Advisory Committee. And we're actually doing a really critical piece of work now, where we have to report next month on a review of what's called here the graduate route. And this is a scheme that was introduced 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, that allows postgraduate students, international postgraduate students, and undergraduate students to stay for a period of time to work. So kind of like in the US, you know, the F1 or J1 visa. But it's not linked specifically to a particular job or sponsor. So it's quite flexible and you know, great for universities who need the funds of international students, and it makes the UK a more attractive destination. It's good also for students to be able to earn back some of that money for all those fees. And also the soft power of, you know, when people go back to their regions, it's alumni links and all the rest of it. However, the government is concerned that it's affecting the quality of higher education, that universities are bringing in students who may not be the most competitive for economic reasons, and that these students are working in domains that they weren't even related to their courses. So it's become highly politically contentious. They're framing it as abuse, even though legally there is no abuse in the discourse in the system, except, you know, perhaps at the technical level of agents and that sort of thing. So it's something that higher education is highly invested in, and the government is also very concerned about this domain because it's a way also to meet migration targets and bring them down. There's also been changes in law as to dependents, so family members of students now not being able to be brought in for master's level courses. And this could have a gendered effect, which academics have critiqued. So this kind of brings together education and migration together, and so that we do other work on the committee as well to do with migration routes and so on. And then most recently now I'm a co-academic director on a large project funded by the Foreign Office, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, because they want to outsource in a way some of the research that they do that informs the policy. So it's a research commissioning centre that we're currently setting up that will produce research across all of their policy areas. And one of the big things, and one of my strong motivations in this, is to have equitable partnerships in the knowledge production that informs this policy from the regions where these policies will be applied, so in the Global South predominantly. And so we're doing, and I'm overseeing what's called the Global South Engagement Strategy. I've been writing that, and it's an ongoing process because we're consulting with the Global South partners. And I'm delighted to say we have AUB as a partner and Birzeit University as a partner that I've brought in.
I'm so glad specifically about Birzeit. I mean, especially in this context now, in war on Gaza. Dina, have you feel at certain point while you are doing policy work that you are in alienation vis-a-vis your research, that your research voice is not sufficiently heard? It's you should do some compromise, for instance, etc. I mean, did you feel? Can you give us this through an example, for instance?
Yes, no, absolutely. I think. Even though we, so for example, the Migration Advisory Committee, we're an independent committee that we're 5 members, and there is a specific remit and scope that is primarily around the economic. And I was invited, along with another member who's in political science, 3 years ago to try to open up this scope. So they were aware of this tight economic focus. And so I'm brought in as the resident sociologist and also someone who engages in more qualitative methodologies. So sometimes it is frustrating that, the sociology is relatively on the margins in understanding these fundamentally sociological issues. And so sometimes I do struggle, like, am I making enough impact in what I'm doing? But at the end of the day, I think to myself, at least you're there, you're a voice around the table, even if you can point to small contributions. And I can give an example. In the first annual report, I was very pleased that I got agreement from the committee that we had one chapter of our report focusing on asylum seekers in the UK, because normally asylum seekers and refugees, because normally that's not a focus, and we advocated for the right for asylum seekers to be able to work in the UK, because currently they're not allowed to, even though in other countries that is the case. So it was still linked to the economic, but we built a sort of sociological case. I've also contributed in terms of trying to have some more conceptual considerations, say, around exploitation. So again, linked to economics, but it's going broader. So those are my small contributions. Of course, at the end of the day, it's whether the government wants to listen to us, but we're quite a well-respected committee. So I view it in that vein.
I see. Look, have you done another Nexus with a more large public? I saw also in your CV some op-eds that you have done in a blog, in newspapers, etc. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and whether you have a feedback from this experience? So it's because if you like, we never say sufficiently, this is inherent part of the research and not supplementary work, auxiliary work.
No, absolutely. And I think this is an area I'd like to develop more. And I think there's different ways that you can do this. So one is, as you say, writing in op-eds and newspaper articles and blogs and that sort of thing, and you get a certain level of engagement. But also what I've been learning with my Disability Under Siege project is really to engage the arts and the humanities with the public. And this is what we've been doing in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Palestine, around the issue of disability, and engaging publics as well as policymakers. And even for policymakers, I think art is a form of knowledge, and it's not just decorative or aesthetic, or just circumscribed to like a leisure activity in a gallery. It can be through media and social media. It can be graffiti. It can be radio and TV in the more traditional modes. And so we've been doing quite a lot of work on arts and funding artists, and also bringing together artists and scientists together. I think one nice example of this, I don't know if you probably know of Visualizing Palestine. So I think that is a fantastic example of using the visual to get across statistics, and so this is something that
infographs, they do, and okay. So for instance, when you say nexus between the disability and arts, so is it the artists do some product and expose where?
Okay, so I'll give you an example. We have a project that we funded. It's called 63 Days of Sit-In. What happened was there was a disability movement in Palestine recently, in the last 2-3 years, that managed by sitting in, like for 63 days they demonstrated and they sat in, and they achieved a massive success of achieving a disability health benefits. It was a major victory. And so we funded an arts company who've worked with these disability artists to produce a documentary on this. And now it's going to be traveling internationally. There's going to be a Berlin Film Festival where they're presenting their work. And there are going to be other outputs also that are more artistic. And so this is being taken to much larger publics to kind of see the benefits of, these kinds of nexus and coming together, as well as also, there's different ways of introducing the arts. So, in part it's, just bringing it into the attention of the public domain, so representation. But sometimes with as social scientists, we don't understand art, so we think of it as, art can be therapy for disabled people, and it can, but it can be much more than that. It's not just a tool; it's also a medium in itself. It's a way of producing knowledge that can engage much more and get the message much more powerfully and shift public understandings, and can be really powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Relationship between audience and language. So, looking again to your CV, most of your publications in English. Did you try to push it into Arabic, into French? Did you try to diversify your audience linguistically? How it's happened? What hurdles you have?
I think that's a really important question, and it's happened on an ad hoc basis. So I've had 1 or 2 articles that say have been translated into Arabic and Spanish, French, but I haven't, I must admit, myself systematically worked on this, and I have been thinking about it in relation to my book on academic freedom, and I have thought of approaching a few publishers to see if there's interest. But I'd welcome your thoughts and any advice.
I will, because specifically your last book, really, it is. I would say it should be a must to be in Arabic.
I would be delighted if that could be done.
So we will. Maybe we will go slowly to the end of this interviews. But again, I wanted to tell us whether you wrote something in your career where it made controversies. If you like, misunderstanding, some didn't like it strongly, and so do you have two examples in your mind about? I know you work really in a domain which is controversial, and the fault line between right and the left, for instance, it's clear. I mean, what the meaning of citizenship, what kind of multiculturalism, what kind of diversity we want.
Yes. So I wouldn't say I've had. I guess I've been very cognizant of this, and I've operated quite strategically in this area. And it's been very, it's been a really interesting experience for me to have been an academic in Lebanon before returning back to the UK, the University of Birmingham, and where you feel your freedoms are. So, I mean, as is reported in the book, you know, there are certain topics that are much more difficult to write about depending on your positionality, and you have to approach it quite differently. Maybe I've been too cautious, I don't know, but I think what I'm really aware of is, you know, the fact that I'm Arab means that my knowledge production is viewed differently than if I was Anglo-Saxon, and I think when you know you're afforded, in some senses, it's not exactly that it's more academic freedom, but your work is more suspect if you're assumed to be of the region or too close to it, and so
sometimes the very fact that you have a name,
it's just my
Arabic,
name. Yeah, it's just
Dina
my name.
Kiwan. I mean,
yeah.
it's
So I mean, I can say. So, for example, now I'm running with our director of research 3 seminars on education in Palestine in the university, and certain incidents have occurred over the last year in this space that have made me quite visible at the university. And then one particular incident happened, which I won't go into, but it put me maybe in a more delicate position. And so I'm not the front face of the organisation of the seminars. I've organised everything in the background. I myself am speaking in a seminar next week, so I'm still committed and I'm still involved. But the director of research, who is a white male, is in a stronger position for him to get all the approvals through the university, and appear to be a more neutral chair. So those are the sorts of things that need to be navigated.
And actually what I love in your book is all the problematization you brought to the neutrality. I mean, when this questions is put on the table, I mean, as a need, and when it is not put on the table on the need, and your whole work on positionality. And I think this is now we learn as a sociologist and as a social scientist in general. I mean, how important, I mean, how we should be transparent and in bringing our... Thank you so much, Dina Kiwan, Professor of Sociology of Education in Birmingham University. We are so delighted to have you. And
well, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation and look forward to working together, future collaboration.
Thank you so much, Dina, and hopefully we will see each other in another episode of podcast. Bye-bye.